A lot of people have seen this trend in rising emissions and ongoing commitments and no real action. A lot of people observed this and concluded that Canada is an environmental laggard. But in fact, if you look at other pollutants, Canada's been very successful at reducing a whole series of pollution, toxic substances, air substances, and basically moved over the same time period to change the profile of emissions quite significantly. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I put together some numbers from Canada's National Pollutant Release Inventory. And so this is an inventory which requires big stationary sources of emissions to produce a detailed report on the quantities and the types of pollution that are released every year. And if you look at some of the main sources of pollutants, things like heavy metals like lead and cadmium and mercury, sulfur dioxide emissions or nitrogen dioxide emissions or volatile organic compound emissions, trends are uniformly down in emissions. So for example, for some of the heavy metals that I looked at, lead and mercury, our emissions are down by 80% or so compared to 1990. So this is the same time frames I was talking about for carbon dioxide emissions. For some of the really important, what we call criteria air contaminant emissions, so these are emissions that affect respiratory health or cause real stress for urban populations or also cause quite significant ecological damage, acid rain, for example. Those emissions are down by, say, anywhere between 20 and 40%, or even 60% in some cases. We've not been an environmental laggard in every field. Our perception of Canadian environmental progress is really made almost uniquely on the carbon front. So people form impressions of Canada's environmental performance by looking at its carbon emissions. But we've actually been quite successful in regulating a lot of what I'm going to call mostly local emissions. And so emissions that stay kind of that affect individuals and affect ecological health close to where they're emitted. And so these are things like heavy metals, these are things like those criteria air contaminant pollutions that I mentioned previously.